Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. So tonight we are obviously going to be talking about The Shadow, the 1994 movie, which was in turn based on the classic radio show character from the 1930s. And so The Shadow actually started off as a narrator for a series of detective radio programs, or I should say detective stories that were told in radio programs. And these programs in turn were meant to boost the sales of a series of pulp detective stories that were put out by the publishing company Street and Smith. But what ended up happening was that the character of the Shadow, even though he was strictly a narrator when he first came out, whenever fans of the radio show would go to get their detective stories from newsstands or what have you, they would almost always ask for the Shadow detective stories, even though the Shadow was just a narrator for the radio program. And so Street and Smith ended up tapping a writer and professional magician, mind you, Walter B. Gibson, to actually come up with a backstory for the character and develop him as, say, an ongoing literary character, for not only the radio show, but also for his own series of pulp detective stories. And so from then on, the Shadow found life in many forms of media, and even within the realm of comic books. And so I just gave you all kind of the abridged version of how the Shadow initially came to be. And if you'll pardon me, I might have to look at some of the notes I wrote from time to time. But I remember the Shadow coming out when in the theater when I was a kid, because I was born in the 80s, raised in the 90s. So in the 90s, I was a kid, But I remember that my dad was really excited about it, because he remembered reading about the Shadow, and I don't know if he ever listened to the radio show program, but he loved stuff like that. So he kind of followed detective stories and history and things like that. And since the Shadow came out in the 1930s, there was a lot of ties to, say, the Great Depression and what have you, as far as it was a bleak time where people kind of looked to, say, a dark savior who would fight crime, and so people like my dad and several others, I mean, they ate stuff like that up. And so I remember my dad was telling me about it, and he even got the Dark Horse 2-issue comic book adaptation of the movie. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think the comic book adaptation may have come out before the movie. And I remember that when I was looking at the comic book for the first time, that was my first exposure to the Shadow ever. I mean, other than say a couple of people mentioning it or having seen posters for the movie and what have you. And I remember there was a whole bunch of merchandise that came out at the time, because they were really wanting to not only have the movie itself be successful, but they were wanting it to start a new franchise, for the modern day, or I should say, bringing a classic character from the past to fans of the modern day. And so or cinema fans of the modern day, I should say. And there was a bunch of merchandise, there were a bunch of toys, t-shirts, and what have you. And I remember that, my dad actually, got me a t-shirt, and unfortunately I no longer have it. I outgrew it and what have you, but I remember it was a really, really cool shirt. And so, So following all that, and having read the comic book, the comic book adaptation was pretty dark. And I want to say the artwork was by Michael Kaluta, who had done a lot of artwork for The Shadow. I think it was with the DC Comics, prior to, doing work for the Dark Horse adaptation of the movie. And I remember that there was, quite a bit of, blood and gore, or at the very least, the violence was very brutal. And I mean, I'd seen some brutal stuff, but, since this was my first exposure to The Shadow, I was like, damn, but it was actually several more years before I actually ended up seeing the movie. And I remember that I liked the movie, but at the same time I was a little disappointed in it because, the comic book adaptation was very dark. I mean, it was cool, but it was very dark in terms of, say, the Shadow and the antagonist, and the lengths they would go to fight one another. And whenever, there was, say, anything in the way of, a gun battle or just a fight with, henchmen, there was, quite a bit of brutality involved. But then I remember seeing the movie, and I remember liking it, but being disappointed in it because, as fun as it was missing the darkness of the comic book adaptation. And so at the time, I didn't really understand that. I'd been told that The Shadow, was based on a pulp, character from, the old school radio days, but I didn't really understand what that entailed. Like, there was a sort of, how shall I say it? There was basically, kind of a, campy quality to it. Almost like, say, the Adam West Batman series. Maybe not that campy, but at the same time, there was a bit of, tongue-in-cheek, type of appeal to, let's say, like, the radio show program. And I can't speak so much for the pulps, because I've never actually read the pulps, but I'm going to guess it kind of went hand in hand. Like, it was just, some, quick fun and what have you. And it wasn't until, say, years later that that other creators, brought some darker aspects to the Shadow character that they weren't able to, necessarily go into and say, like, in the 1930s, I guess. And then I saw the movie again, a while back, and my impression of it, in some ways it had softened, but in other ways, I was still disappointed, but then, fast forward several more years later, where, courtesy of things like YouTube, I was able to, listen to, say, some of the, old school, Shadow, programs. Maybe not all the way through, but snippets and what have you, to the point of where, I at least had an idea of, what the Shadow was originally like as a character. And so having, listened to some of that stuff, as well as, maybe, reading a few more comic books here and there, a while back, that had the Shadow and had more of a pulp influence, I think I appreciated the movie more, because while I was missing the darkness that was strongly present in the comic book adaptation from Dark Horse, for the movie, I think that the movie did a good job of paying respect and, homage to to the Shadow's roots. And so overall, I think The Shadow is actually a good movie. And it's strange how, it takes, time to in some cases, get to a point where you can appreciate a movie as it was intended to be, as opposed to, say, you want your expectations for it from, say, maybe from another source and what have you. But yeah, so let's get into the story. So the story kicks off with the character of Lamont Cranston, who is hiding out in Asia and is living as a drug lord, or specifically an opium dealer by the name of Yinko. And he's a very ruthless individual, and he's perfectly willing to kill both friends and foes, if it means achieving his goals. But then, one night he's abducted and by agents of a holy man by the name of Tulku, or I should say the Tulku. And this guy is able to possess, he's able to manipulate, the perceptions of those around him to a point of, say, being able to, hypnotize people, as well as, say, cloud their minds to a point where, they're unable to, see, a person or a thing that he doesn't, want them to see. And, basically, he persuades Yinko, or Lamont Cranston, I should say, to learn from him and to go on a path of redemption, to use his connections with the criminal underworld, to basically turn about and fight crime. And so working with Lamont over a period of time, he is able to craft a new individual. And Lamont Cranston uses the skills they learn from the Tulku to take it upon himself to form a new identity, namely the vigilante known as the Shadow. And he returns to New York City, where he was originally from, and he puts his new skills to use, and this forms a sort of secretive organization of agents, who keep tabs on the goings-ons of the criminal underworld and relay the information to him. And so, when he's in his, sort of, socialite identity of Lamont Cranston, he's able to interact with, those in authority, such as, with his uncle, who is a police commissioner. Give me a sec here. Commissioner Wainwright Barth, who, as an agent of the law, I mean, he's privy to all sorts of information, about what's going on with the criminal underworld. And so, Lamont Cranston is able to, sort of play up his airheaded, socialite status, and is able to kind of get in on what's going on, and what the police department knows. But, he's constantly having to hypnotize his uncle, to where, his uncle, who was about to, form a task force to look into the Shadow, because the Shadow's, constantly interfering with police business, in terms of, say, fighting crime. Cranston's having to hypnotize him and tell him, you're not going to, put together a task force. It's not worth, the time or resources. And so, his uncle will come out of a trance and be like, oh yeah, forget the task force, and it's just a bad idea, that kind of thing. And so, but then when he, operates as a Shadow, he's able to put that information to use that he's, got from, those who work for him. And his agents, for the most part, seem to consist of people whom he saved, from, the criminal elements of the city. And so, as kind of like a debt of gratitude, they become his agents, and whenever he calls on them, whether it be in the form of the shadow or as Lamont Cranston, or say even as sending one of his own agents to another agent to get information and what have you, these agents, it's like they end up being willing to work for the shadow. And so when he becomes the shadow, though, he's able to use the knowledge that he's learned from his agents, and also the skills that he learned from being mentored by the Tulku, and he's able to become for all intents and purposes, a supernatural avenger of the night. And while he himself isn't supernatural, I mean, the skills he has learned, could arguably be called supernatural, because he's able to essentially hypnotize people, as well as cloud their minds and basically their perceptions, to where to their own eyes they cannot see him unless he wills it, and the only thing they can see of him is his shadow, and that sort of contributes to the supernatural perception that the criminal underworld has of the shadow, because whenever they go up against him, oftentimes they just see a shadow coming at them, and this ominous booming laugh that seems to be coming from everywhere. So he's like a nightmare for the criminal underworld, and he's made headway in terms of, say, fighting crime within New York City, but one day, though, a fellow pupil, someone else who was mentored by the Tulku, ends up coming to New York City, and this individual is Shiwan Khan, who not only was a former pupil of the Tulku, but is the last descendant of Ghengis Khan. And Shiwan Khan has this goal of taking over the world, and and the way he puts it, Genghis Khan conquered, I think he said conquered half the world, I think is what he said, and he wants to finish the job, and he tries to he comes to Cranston's quarters, and tries to persuade him to join him, and while they have some stuff in common in terms of having, say, criminal backgrounds, as well as being exceptionally skilled in the abilities of clouding men's minds and hypnotism, Cranston is at a point where, while he doesn't deny his dark past, he's genuinely trying to be a better person, and he's using his darkness to fight crime, and he turns Shiwan Khan down, and Khan becomes more than a little pissed off at him, or at Yin Ko, and because he insists on calling him Yin Ko, because the criminal Yin Ko was basically a dark legend in Asia, and that's how Shiwan Khan came to admire him, and he's trying to convince Cranston that this face you wear for the everyday world is just a mask, and this darkness you exude at night, this is who you really are, but you should be using it to take your dues in blood. And so he's really trying to get Cranston to join him in taking over the world, but Cranston, he's like, not having it. And so having been turned down, Shiwan Khan, he uses his skills of hypnotism and clouding men's minds, as well as his army, which he had brought to the city, his army of henchmen, I should say. He targets a military scientist by the name of Reinhardt Lane, who is in the process of trying to invent what will eventually be called, he's trying to invent what will eventually be known as the atomic bomb. And he's working for the War Department. And so Shiwan Khan is able to reach out and hypnotize him from afar, and he's able to bend Reinhardt Lane to his will, to where he starts to not only continue to work on the project that he was doing for the military, but enhance it as well to make it even more deadly. And this in turn brings about the character of Margot Lane, Reinhardt Lane's daughter, and she makes the acquaintance of Lamont Cranston at this fancy nightclub, and the two of them hit it off in a strange way, because it turns out that Margot Lane, much like Lamont Cranston and Shiwan Khan, has latent skills in the realm of telepathy, to a point where she doesn't really understand this gift that she has, but oftentimes she's able to pick up thoughts and feelings of people around her. And once she and Lamont Cranston meet, it's like sparks fly, because here are two people who have skills in the realm of say extrasensory perception or telepathy and what have you. And whereas Lamont Cranston is skilled and knows how to consciously use these abilities, Margot Lane doesn't, and yet she's still able to avoid being hypnotized, unless it's say an extreme effort, and which ends up happening when Shiwan Khan is able to hypnotize her, because whereas Lamont Cranston uses hypnosis to persuade people to maybe forget about him or something like that, he doesn't try to enslave people. And so Shiwan Khan, on the other hand, he is more than willing to enslave Margot Lane. And so once Cranston is able to be, I guess you could say, more of a thorn in Khan's side, than he had originally anticipated, he is able to make Margot Lane a slave to his will and have her, try and kill the Shadow. But in the process of trying to kill the Shadow, she ends up, going to Lamont Cranston's place, and Cranston's able to, break her out of her trance, but, by doing so, he's revealed himself to be the Shadow, because she was sent to kill the Shadow, and she, in her trance state, went to Cranston's place, and so she puts two and two together, and Cranston tries to make her forget, but it's not working. And so he reluctantly, lets her in on his secret of who he is and, his organization of agents and what have you. And speaking of agents, one of his newest agents is a scientist, a guy by the name of Roy Tam, who Cranston, in the guise of the Shadow, had saved him from a couple of criminals who were about to kill him by way of putting cement shoes on him and sending him to sleep with a fish, for having witnessed a murder that they had committed. And so the Shadow had saved Tam's life and made him one of his agents, and told him one day an agent of mine or myself will call you, as in either an agent on his behalf or he himself would get in touch with him and might have need of his knowledge. And so so he ends up having to, go to Tam, and because he's trying to figure out, what Khan is trying to do with his resources, and so, by working with Tam, he realizes that Khan is using this metal agent called bronzium, which has all sorts of ramifications for nuclear fission, and that's when Cranston and Tam learned that Shiwan Khan is trying to make an atomic bomb, and this is in the 1930s, mind you, so the atomic bomb had not actually been made yet, but since this is like a fictional form of history, well, there you go. And so the two of them work together, and then once they realize what Khan's trying to do, Cranston ends up going into his shadow guys to try and stop Khan, because he realizes that when he's using bronzium to enhance the bomb, then the devastation will be beyond astronomical, and so that's why Khan's hypnotized Reinhardt Lane, and to make this bomb happen. So it's like it would be an atomic bomb up to 11. And so so that's that's the basic gist of the movie right there. But this was actually a pretty cool movie. I mean, I think that having, like I said earlier, once I had some exposure to what the Shadow was initially like as a character by way of listening to bits and pieces from, say, old school radio dramas, I mean, and also having read a little bit here and there of older Shadow stories, or at the very least Shadow stories that were in the style of old school Shadow stories. I definitely think that The Shadow as a movie is a good movie, because it definitely has that feel of an old school pulp detective story with a bit of a would-be world-conquering villain thrown in for good measure. And also, one of the things I really enjoyed about this movie is that it looks and feels like something you would find in a comic book. And the production design was by a guy named give me a sec here, Joseph E. Nemec III, and he and his crew did a really good job of recreating a 1930s New York, or New York City, I should say, but making it to where there's it's kind of like some of the architecture you would probably have seen in the first Tim Burton Batman movie. I mean, things look kind of exaggerated in some ways. Excuse me. But that's part of the charm, I think, because it adds to that sort of comic book feel. And so while in some respects it looks like something that was legitimately from the 1930s, there's also that fantastical element, such as say some of the technology that the Shadows organization uses to send messages to one another, these code rings, I guess you'd call them, that light up whenever the Shadow needs to talk to one of his agents, that kind of thing. And so there was definitely that old school pulp feel to it, as well as a straight up comic book feel to it, and that's something that I really appreciate about it, because I'm so, like a lot of people, I think I'm so used to seeing quote unquote comic book movies, courtesy of, say, Marvel Studios or DC, the DC comic movies, and so we kind of take stuff like that for granted. But seeing a movie that had its roots as say first a radio show program, and then some straight up pulp detective stories, basically giving us that comic book feel, that, and it actually feels organic. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And you also have a wonderful score by the late, I just want to make sure I say the name right, because I sometimes get them mixed up here. Jerry Goldsmith. Yeah, the late Jerry Goldsmith. You have a fantastic score, from him. And anytime Jerry Goldsmith's involved in something, I mean, 90% of the time you're going to get something good. And, The Shadow is definitely one of his, good scores. It's something that is, at once fanciful and spooky when it needs to be. And also the cast in this movie is really good too, because you have Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston, aka Yin Ko, aka the Shadow. And sometimes you have it to where an actor, they might do good in, say, a comic book characters, or I should say, a comic book like character. They might do a good job playing their civilian alter ego, but they might stumble when playing, say, their actual vigilante or superhero alter ego, or vice versa. Kind of look at, say, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. I mean, you have, Tobey Maguire, who a lot of people thought was good as Peter Parker, but, wasn't as good as Spider-Man. Whereas, and then you have Andrew Garfield, who a lot of people thought, was okay as Peter Parker, but was good as Spider-Man. Well, Alec Baldwin actually does a good job both as Lamont Cranston and the Shadow. And so, because he has this sort of, Bruce Wayne, like persona, when he's playing Lamont Cranston, because, he's playing up that, sort of, entitled socialite, dude who, basically, has a lot of money and wealth, and, a lot of people, see him as someone vapid. And so he sort of plays up that, vapid persona. But at the same time, there's an intensity to him in more isolated moments to where you see that, that vapid persona is just a persona. Like, he's really, keeping an eye on, trying to keep an eye on everything around him. He's keeping tabs on, what, news of the underworld is coming out, that kind of thing. Like, who knows what, and so, and that's something that Bruce Wayne, aka Batman, was constantly doing. And so, Batman was in some ways inspired by the Shadow. And so it's very fitting that, you have, Alec Baldwin, who, if I remember correctly, was also considered to, play Batman in the first, Tim Burton Batman movie, before Michael Keaton was cast. So it's rather fitting in a lot of ways that someone like Alec Baldwin was able to, play, this, character, both as, say, Lamont Cranston and the Shadow. Because, like I said, when he's Lamont Cranston, I mean, he's, playing up a persona, but then, when he's, not playing up that persona, you see this guy is, very intelligent and very calculating in a lot of ways. But he's also haunted by his time as Yin Ko, because, he doesn't deny that he was an evil man at one point. But he's trying to use his experience in the realms of evil and trying to turn it around in order to, fight on the side of good, and sometimes, the only way you can really, fight evil is to fight fire with fire, or at the very least, use a form of good that is shrouded in darkness, as it were. And so when, when Alec Baldwin is playing the Shadow, that's when, he really, gets to shine, because, he sort of, plays up, this, this ominous vigilante, who, on one hand, from the perspective of, those, he's going up against, it's like they don't know where he is. They just hear this, very scary laugh and this voice that seems to be coming from everywhere. And, and they don't see him unless he lets them see him, or they only see his shadow, that kind of thing. Alec Baldwin, really, does a good job in terms of, say, playing up that, dark persona, but also, from a physical standpoint as well, because, the wardrobe department, when they have him, with the, the fedora and the long coat, and the, the red bandana that he uses to cover his face. I mean, Alec Baldwin looks the part and plays the part very well. And so I know that Alec Baldwin, in real life, I mean, he's been kind of a, I mean, let's just say that there's a lot of things that have come out about him to where, the consensus is like he's a great actor, but, probably not a nice person. And so, so yeah, I mean, bearing that in mind, though, I mean, if you can separate the art from the artist, I mean, Alec Baldwin did a really good job in this, movie. And also you have John Lone, who is a very underrated actor, giving a wonderful performance as the evil Shiwan Khan. And you could definitely tell that John Lone was having fun with the part, because he gets to add a flourish to this evil character, to where it's like this guy is a bad guy, but at the same time it feels like something straight out of a pulp story, because I mean, on one hand, there is that sort of in some respects there's like a tongue-in-cheek quality, but at the same time, though, he's definitely he sells the fact that Shiwan Khan is a legitimate threat to the Shadow, because on one hand it's like he does a good job of trying to play up the fact that he's wanting to bring the Shadow into his fold, like his interactions with Alec Baldwin, as Shiwan Khan and Lamont Cranston respectively. It's like you really see these two guys playing off of one another, and you do see shades of the, I guess you could say, the darker aspects of the character that were added over time, coming out, with Lamont Cranston, and also with Shiwan Khan, you get those moments where it's like you really see that this guy is serious about taking over the world. I mean, yes, there might be a campy aspect in the sense of that tongue-in-cheek quality in some scenes, but at the same time, make no mistake, I mean, Shiwan Khan is a very dangerous villain, and he has the power, both in terms of himself as well as his organization, to very well hold New York City, hostage and achieve his goals of, having this, nuclear, bomb created, or this atomic bomb created, I should say. And yeah, so yeah, just John Lone, I mean, he did a good job playing Shiwan Khan and made Shiwan Khan a memorable villain. And also, you had Penelope. Let's see how. Give me a sec. Penelope Ann Miller playing Margot Lane, and she. See, I've seen her in a couple of things, but she was really good here. I mean, she looked fantastic, very easy on the eyes, very beautiful, but also in terms of how she played Margot Lane, she did a really nice job, because you saw someone who in some ways seemed kind of out of her depth in terms of, say, how she interacts with those around her. But then again, though, when they go into the telepathy that her character has, and you think about how people with some form of telepathy have been portrayed in the media, I mean, or even people in real life who are able to, say, pick up on how other people are feeling, like empathic, that kind of thing. Like, that is a thing. And you look at stuff like that, and Penelope Ann Miller actually does a pretty good job, portraying that. Because in some respects, she kind of comes across as a cloud cuckoo lander, in the sense that she's sort of, in her own world. But at the same time, though, it's like she has, one foot in her own world, but the other foot is set in the world around her. So, it's not that she's unaware of what's going on around her, but at the same time, it's like she's trying to exist in both worlds. And so, when she meets Lamont Cranston, I mean, it's like she finally has someone in her life who gets her, because he himself is trying to live in two worlds as well. And she did a really good job depicting that, I thought. And also she had really good chemistry with Alec Baldwin, I thought. And even say in the moments where she's hypnotized by, like, say, Shiwan Khan, or I should say the scene where she's hypnotized by Shiwan Khan, she does a good job of portraying her character falling under a spell, and so she did she was really good in the part. And also other reviewers have pointed out that she has her own strength to her, to where she's not just a helpless damsel in distress. I mean, there are moments where she's a damsel in distress, but then there are moments where she's actually able to help Cranston. And there's even a scene where she literally saves his life. And so you get that character who she definitely, for people who like, I guess you could say, strong female characters. I mean, Margot Lane, as portrayed by Penelope Ann Miller, is a believable, strong female character. Like, she's not invulnerable or anything like that. In fact, I mean, she needs to be saved a few times too, but they balance it out by having her actually being able to help Cranston save the day, that kind of thing, or even help him from time to time. So it's like it's back and forth between the two, and I like that balance. Because a lot of movies these days, it's like they try to sell the strong female character, but they in an effort to make her look good, they make everyone else around her look like an idiot. Like, say, Thor: Love and Thunder, they make Thor look like an idiot in order to make Natalie Portman's character look good, that kind of thing. But here, though, it's like there's an almost equal footing between the two, between Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane. And I really like that, because, I mean, she's a strong character who felt believable. Like, she wasn't, without weakness, that kind of thing. And so, and also you have Sir Ian McKellen playing Margot Lane's father, Reinhardt Lane. And, he doesn't have like a huge part in the movie, but at the same time, though, I mean, he's memorable because he does a really good job of playing this absent-minded professor. I mean, literally, because there are moments where, like, he'll be working on something, and Margot will be coming to see him, and she'll be, telling him about her day, and he'll just say, "Ah, that's nice, dear," and then he'll say something that makes it clear that he wasn't actually listening to her, like, because he's caught up in his work and everything. But at the same time, it's like he's acknowledging her, but at the same time, he's not really listening to her, that kind of thing, because he's literally in his own world, like, like daughter, like father, like, it's like, so I'm kind of wondering if, maybe there was a bit where it would have been interesting if maybe that, sense of telepathy, had been genetic or something like that, and like it would have been nice to see if maybe some of that had come from Reinhardt Lane to Margot Lane, or if it was just he's an absent-minded professor and she just got the luck of the draw in terms of actually being telepathic with a little bit of Cuckoo Lander tendencies as well. And so it was fun seeing Ian McKellen playing this kind of part, even though he didn't have a huge part in the movie. Like, it was an important part because, I mean, he's an absent-minded professor who is being compelled to make an atomic bomb before an atomic bomb actually existed in real life. So he's definitely an important part of the movie. It's just that he doesn't have a huge part, but when we do see him, he is fun to watch, because he does a good job of, playing someone who's lost in their own world and their own, technological doodads and what have you. And then you have the great Tim Curry playing his assistant Farley Claymore, and assistant was probably underselling the character's skills, because he's actually able to work on what is going to be an atomic bomb as well, except he ends up turning traitor and siding with Shiwan Khan, because he's convinced that if he helps Shiwan Khan, then he'll be a king in the guy's kingdom. And Shiwan Khan doesn't really like that, because he wants to be the only king in town, so to speak. But Tim Curry, it's like, I remember the first time I saw the movie, I thought he was like, very campy and over the top. But then, once again, keeping in with the roots of the character, and I guess you could say his supporting cast and what have you. I mean, Farley Claymore, fit very well with it, and Tim Curry did a good job, playing, that type of character. But I also like the fact that, you saw him gradually going insane, because on one hand, I mean, yes, he's willingly serving Shiwan Khan without having to be hypnotized, but at the same time, you also see that Shiwan Khan's influence on him is making him more and more unhinged, to a point where when he comes into contact with the Shadow, when he goes up against him, you definitely see that he's unraveling, and Tim Curry just plays him as like a sniveling maniac. And so, yeah, Tim Curry did a good job in the part. I mean, not a huge part, but at the same time, much like Ian McKellen, a memorable part. And so, and also, it's Tim Curry. It's always fun to watch the man work. I know everyone, remembers him as Rocky, Dr. Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror Picture Show, but personally, I remember him as the Lord of Darkness from Legend. So, it's always, a treat, seeing, Tim Curry in his more human form, as it were, because it's like you see him in Legend and all that prosthetic makeup, made him look like a Lord of Darkness, which, he did a great job playing. But, seeing him in a very human role like this one, albeit, a human role where the character is gradually going insane, Tim Curry did a good job, and you could tell he was having fun with the part. But yeah, you also have the late Peter Boyle as Moe Shrevnitz. I hope I'm saying the character's last name right. But Moe was one of Cranston's agents, and he was his cab driver as well. And, Peter Boyle, he has this very understated part. And if you've seen Peter Boyle in just about anything he does, he's very good at playing, understated parts. He's got this sort of snarky, been there, done that, seen it all, very little phases him, that kind of thing. Like, he's really good at playing those kind of characters. And as Moe, once again, he does a good job playing that kind of character. And also, though, I liked, this glimpse you got, into, his motivation in working for Cranston, or the Shadow, because you get, an idea that the Shadow had saved his life at one point. He even comes out and says, like when he's giving Dr. Tim, his ring, I mean, he's telling him, don't ever take it off. And Tim's like, who are you? And he's like, I'm just like you. I'm a guy that, the Shadow saved, and I work for him, now, because he gave me a new chance at life. And so, I like that little glimpse of backstory you got. But, whenever, he's, working with, Lamont Cranston, or, the Shadow, there's this sense of, loyalty, there's a bit where after a shootout, he's got, the Shadow in his car, and he's looking, at the rear view mirror, and he's like, hey, boss, you okay? Like genuine concern, right? And then, because you see, the Shadow in the back seat, like you see, the character sort of shifting around, like you can't see exactly what he's doing, but then he comes back up, and, he's Lamont Cranston, and you see that, that he's really tired and what have you, but at the same time, it's like he appreciates, that, Moe's, genuinely looking out for him. And so he's kind of, you get that sense that these two have worked together for a long time. And there were a couple of moments where, Peter Boyle, he's got this, comedic gift. Once again, the whole understated portrayal comes into play. But, you have this moment I remember where you see him reading this book, and it's about how to develop, your extrasensory perception or something like that. Because he's like, okay, how, he's obviously wanting to, pick up a little bit of, what the shadow's able to do, and so he's looking at this book, and he's like, I sense someone's coming. And then you see this, bad guy fall out of a billion-story, window, falling to his death. And so that was actually pretty funny, I thought. So yeah, the late great Peter Boyle, he did a good job in the part too that he was into as Moe, the loyal cab driver. And by the way, the production people did a wonderful job of not only recreating New York City from the 1930s, as well as playing up this more gothic comic book version of New York City, but also they made all the cars and stuff look really authentic, and I would even say sexy, because some cars do look sexy. I'll just go ahead and say it, but yeah, they did a really good job on making Peter Boyle's taxi, or I should say Moe's taxi. They did a good job of designing that, because it's like whenever the taxi's in action, whenever Moe's behind the wheel, it's pretty cool to see. And so yeah, all in all, you had this really good cast here. And you also have Jonathan Winters as the commissioner of the police force, and Lamont Cranston's uncle. And Jonathan Winters, he doesn't have a huge part, but at the same time, much like Ian McKellen and Tim Curry, he does a good job with the brief amount of time that in the times that we do see him, he does a good job, because he's playing this commissioner who's trying to maintain law and order in a city that's constantly dealing with crime, but at the same time he's also trying to contend with the fact that this vigilante, the Shadow, is seemingly doing the police department's work for them in terms of, say, all these bad guys he's been apprehending. And so I liked how whenever he's with Lamont Cranston, he's constantly complaining about how out of touch he is with what's been going on in the city, and because he's so caught up in his playboy lifestyle. And the irony is that Lamont Cranston, like I said, he's playing up the playboy persona, but in reality, he's a very shrewd and calculating individual who is very up to date as far as what's going on in the city. So I like that bit of him playing a part, or playing up the part, in order to convince his uncle that he's just a vapid playboy. And Jonathan Winters does a good job of portraying that mixture of love for his nephew, but also I guess you could say love and fondness for his nephew, but also annoyance with the same nephew as well for being a vapid airhead socialite. So and the bits where you see him being hypnotized by Cranston, like whenever Cranston's trying to make him forget about putting together another task force again for the Shadow, Jonathan Winters does a really good job of playing the part of being hypnotized, and then snapping out and being like, forget the task force, So he goes from being angry and determined to go after the Shadow to forget about the Shadow. The guy's just an urban legend anyway, So he's really good at going from one end to another. And so yeah, Jonathan Winters, he's always been a good actor, but it was fun seeing him in this part too. So yeah, all in all, you have a really good cast of actors, playing some good characters, and you have Russell Mulcahy directing the movie, and I would honestly say that this is one of his good movies, because he's a director who had a legitimately good start. His very first film. Actually, let me just back up a bit. Russell Mulcahy had an extensive background in doing music videos for many artists in the '80s. Duran Duran, Elton John, Rod Stewart, the Human League, the Buggles, and he also had the distinction of directing the very first music video for MTV, which was in fact "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Buggles. So, good song, good video, and yeah, that was definitely a distinction that Russell Mulcahy had. And then he made his first theatrical film, which was a really cool Australian environmental horror film called Razorback, which is like, imagine Jaws, but instead of a shark, you've got this killer 900-pound razorback warthog that's terrorizing the landscape of Australia, and so that was actually a pretty cool movie, and he used his background as a music video director, to make what could have been just a simple killer warthog movie into a very atmospheric and at times eerie horror film. But then he did Highlander, which is arguably his best known and best movie, which it was a mixture of urban fantasy, as well as just imaginative world building as well. And it was an iconic movie, and once again you saw how his background as a music video director really came into play in terms of how he filmed the movie. And so he had a really good start with Razorback and Highlander. And of course, Highlander has gone on to be regarded as an 80s urban fantasy classic, or I guess I could say just an 80s fantasy classic. But I like to throw in the term urban fantasy because it takes place in a gritty urban environment. But unfortunately, though, after Highlander, his career as a movie director kind of took a nosedive because he did Highlander 2, which is not only one of the worst sequels ever made, but a really bad movie in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others. And it was so bad that anytime another Highlander movie came up, they just kind of pretended that Highlander 2 never happened. And also, when the TV series came out, they straight up ignored Highlander 2. So, there you go. But then he did a couple other movies, and I remember he did the movie Ricochet, which had Denzel Washington, pre-major stardom, and John Lithgow in a very evil role. And Ricochet is one of those movies that there were things I liked about the movie, but I didn't really like the movie itself, but it definitely has its fans. But he did those two movies and a couple of others, which I haven't seen. And so it seemed like, he went from, having a genuinely good start into, sort of, doing ho-hum movies. And then The Shadow comes along. And, you're watching this movie, you definitely see, how, everyone's firing on all cylinders. You have, great production design, you have a wonderful soundtrack, you have, good actors, playing, interesting characters. And then, of course, you have, Russell Mulcahy, once again tapping into, his visual artistry, that he, showed on hand with Razorback and Highlander. And, you have a very visually distinctive movie. And unfortunately, though, while I honestly think that this was a good movie, and so do quite a few others who have seen the movie over time, it bombed when it came out because it had a budget of $40 million, but unfortunately it only made $48 million, including domestic and worldwide, and so it bombed financially speaking. And also, if I remember correctly, it was up against movies like The Lion King and The Mask. And so this was in 1994. So, The Lion King and The Mask were both massive, box office successes. And so The Shadow, unfortunately, paled in comparison to those two movies, when it comes to, say, financial performance. And also, a lot of critics at the time, from what I've read, they didn't really, dig the movie. And I mean, there were a few people who liked it, like Roger Ebert. He gave it 3 out of 4 stars, which, I mean, 3 stars from Roger Ebert. Hey, that's a good sign. But anyway, though, yeah. Over time, though, I think The Shadow, it seems like The Shadow has kind of become regarded as a cult classic, much like, Razorback and Highlander, except, I would argue Highlander is actually a legitimate classic nowadays. But The Shadow, though, I think joins those two movies as something that, maybe when it came out, it didn't do very well, but maybe in some ways it was ahead of its time. But years after, its theatrical release, it's found a dedicated audience. And it's one of those bits where, on one hand, better late than never, but on the other hand, it's sad that the movie didn't perform well financially, because Russell Mulcahy and everyone involved in the movie, I think, did a really good job in the part, or in their parts and everything. I mean, the movie looked good. It was fun, and very atmospheric. And as I said, it feels like a comic book movie, or it feels like you're walking into a world of an old school comic book. It's sad that it didn't do well when it came out. I mean, I know, as I said, better late than never, but there was so much potential, for them to, extend the world of The Shadow, at least in the realm of cinema, because like I said at the beginning, they had, all sorts of merchandise for the movie, like, toys and, what have you. And, and I'm not well versed in the lore of The Shadow, but I do know that there are, a lot of other characters, from The Shadow that, it would have been cool to see, further explored or introduced on screen and what have you. And, the world of The Shadow that we see here in this movie, there's a lot going on, to where it's like we get the fact that there is a history, and it does a good job of world building, to a point where, on one hand, it's a good standalone movie, but at the same time, though, it shows that there's clearly more room to tell further stories. And had the movie been a financial success, I think that in another world where this movie was a financial success, I mean, we would have seen the world of The Shadow further explored. I mean, now whether or not Russell Mulcahy would stay on as director, I mean, you would definitely have Alec Baldwin playing the part, so of Lamont Cranston and The Shadow, and Penelope and Miller as Margot Lane. I mean, those two would definitely be, constants for sure. But unfortunately, the movie bombed when it came out, so that never happened. And as it is, The Shadow is a good standalone movie. And so, I guess if I had to, say, what the movie's shortcomings were, some of it kind of, ties back to, my initial first impression of the movie, because that 2-issue comic book adaptation that was put out by Dark Horse, that was literally my first exposure to the character, other than having heard about him from my dad. But that was like a quite a first impression, because it was a very, moody, very violent world that, the character lived in. And, when I saw the movie for the first time, and I was, met with the sort of tongue-in-cheek comic bookish feel, when I say comic book, I mean more fun feel, there was that inevitable bit of disappointment, which, even though I'm still able to enjoy the movie, for what it is, in the sense that it's trying to recreate, a pulp hero from the 1930s where, the atmosphere was kind of tongue-in-cheek in some ways. I mean, it's good at doing that. I mean, it is, and also it's a good movie. But at the same time, though, I do miss the darkness that, got me interested in the character in the first place. Now, to be fair, there are moments in the movie where that darkness does come out, namely in, moments where, Shiwan Khan and Lamont Cranston are squaring off with one another in terms of, say, their verbal back and forth with one another. And like Alec Baldwin and John Lone, they do such a good job of playing off of one another. And you get, these moments where, I mean, you have some amusing moments in these interactions, such as, a bit where, Shiwan Khan, like when he's, when he's trying to get, Cranston to, come into his side, and Alec Baldwin, does this bit where he's like, "You're insane. I know a really good psychiatrist." And of course that pisses, Shiwan Khan off. And so it's like, it's really, interesting, seeing them sort of snipe at one another and spar with one another from a verbal standpoint, but then when you get those moments where John Lone, playing Shiwan Khan, is trying to, get, Alec Baldwin's Lamont Cranston just admit, that, he's not who he's pretending to be. Like, he's really, the dark Yin Ko that, he, learned to, admire over the years. It's like, you see, this bit of denial, of, Cranston's, true identity. Like, he's trying to, deny that, he's not evil, or he, the evil isn't a part of him anymore, but then he's forced to admit that it is still a part of him. He's just trying to channel it in more constructive manners in terms of, say, fighting crime. So you have those moments where, you get that glimpse of inner darkness, from a psychological standpoint. But, as good as those moments are, they're kind of fleeting. And so it's nice that they're there. And so you do see that, the Shadow, as fun as, the Shadow's world is, it's not without its darkness. I mean, it's not just the name that's dark. There actually is a darkness to the character. And as, other, people have pointed out, when The Shadow was first put out, it came out around the time of the Great Depression, in the 1930s. And a lot of people, grew up listening to The Shadow or reading his stories because it's like they were wanting an escape, from, this dark reality that they had to live in. And so The Shadow gave them a character who lived in their world, but was able to transcend its, boundaries. Like, he was able to live in the darkness, but at the same time, show that there was a way out of the darkness, for, for others, that kind of thing. And so you kind of see that you see moments like that in the movie, but I just think that it might have benefited more from having a darker approach in some aspects. I mean, not doing away with, the fun feel of the movie, but just maybe having, stronger moments where, the characters and in turn the audience are reminded of, the dark reality of, living in, the world around them, that kind of thing. And also, and you get another good moment where Margot Lane, is able to, look inside Cranston's mind, and, you see, you see like two different versions of him. Like, you see him as Lamont Cranston, but then, you see him sort of come out of the shadows as Yin Ko, and he looks really, really spooky, and he's, pointing at her saying, "You're not supposed to be here," like in his mind, and then she gets this glimpse of this battle he was in, back when he was Yin Ko in Asia. And so that bit that we saw, it's like, okay, there was definitely a dark side to this character, other than, him, being an urban legend, nightmare for criminals. It's like you see that there actually was a darkness, to who he used to be, where like he wantonly killed people, and enjoyed it. So, that's what I'm trying to say, I guess. It's like the glimpses that we get of that, I think, would have made the movie stronger on an emotional level. I mean, and not wanting to do away with the, comic book fun of the movie, but just maybe, having those, moments of darkness be stronger. Like, I'm not trying to say the Shadow needs to be, Christopher Nolan Batman or anything like that, but, I think it would have, I think it might have been a more substantial film, if that darkness had been more present, other than, say, only present in fleeting glimpses that we get. So, let's see. And the other thing I think is that, while the tongue-in-cheek tone of the movie, in a lot of ways works in its favor, especially if you're familiar with how the Shadow started out, I do think that a lot of audiences, myself included, who kind of grew up on more, I guess you could say, more relatable, characters when it comes to comic book movies, where, the characters in these movies, while yes, they're, comic book characters in a comic book movie, they were able to, play the part in a way to where it's like you felt like you were watching a realistic person who just happened to have superpowers or something like that. Like they felt relatable, as a three-dimensional human being. Like if you look at Chris Evans as, Captain America, or Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, or Tom Holland as Spider-Man, or Michael Keaton as Batman, Christopher Reeve as Superman. I mean, they sold the fact that they were these characters in, these comic book based worlds, but at the same time though, they felt very, three-dimensional, both, with their flaws and their, gifts as well, as, playing these characters. And so, you compare all that to this movie, and I think that, some audiences, while they might enjoy the movie, in some respects, I think they might be disappointed, because they're so used to seeing, the type of, characters and the types of movies that I just described. And then you have, the Shadow, which is, potentially a dark character, and, is dark in moments in the movie. But for the most part, though, is kind of stuck in the, sort of tongue-in-cheek, comic book fun, of, the character's roots. And so I think it just depends on your, own perspective. It's kind of like on a case-by-case basis. Like if you kind of brush up on, the lore of the Shadow, or maybe listen to, some bits and pieces of, the old school radio dramas, I mean, I think that, going into the movie, one can gain an appreciation for what the movie is, as opposed to, say, being wholly disappointed to, say, it not measuring up to, say, the, comic book, movies that have come after it, or I should say, the quote-unquote superhero movies that have come after that. Like, for example, one movie I can think of that is very similar to The Shadow in terms of, say, the, character, but in a lot of ways is a better movie, is Darkman, directed by Sam Raimi with Liam Neeson in the title role. And that came about, ironically, because Sam Raimi had wanted to do The Shadow, back in the 80s, but he couldn't get the rights to it. And so he ended up just, saying, screw it, I'll just do my own movie with my own character, who's definitely, influenced by The Shadow. And so as a result, we had a movie that was very comic book, influenced. Like, it felt like you were, stepping into a comic book world in the movie of Darkman. But I think that because there was that creative freedom with, having, an original character, Sam Raimi did a better job of, balancing the line between comic book fun and comic book darkness, to where it's like there's a real sense of, menace, if that makes any sense, in comparison to this movie. Not to say that, John Lone's performance as Shiwan Khan, it wasn't menacing. I mean, he has moments of being menacing, but it's more, fun menacing as opposed to legitimately dangerous menacing, if that makes sense. And so, like I say, I think it depends on, case by case, what the, audience is looking for. And when it comes to, say, superhero or comic book based movies, or comic book like movies, I should say. So if you bear that in mind, I think that, you'll definitely enjoy The Shadow, or in some respects you might be disappointed, but at the same time still have a fun time with it. But me personally, I honestly thought this was a good movie. And I got to a point where I could appreciate it on its own merits, as opposed to, say, trying to compare it to all these other comic book type movies or comic book based movies. And I know The Shadow isn't based on a comic book, but it does have that environment and atmosphere. But I'm going to go ahead and give The Shadow 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good, fun movie. As far as special features go, you have a couple of interviews with director Russell Mulcahy, as well as actors Alec Baldwin and Penelope and Miller, as well as production designer Joseph Nemec III, who I had mentioned did a wonderful job when it came to creating this world on screen. And then you have director of photography Stephen H. Burum, and the screenwriter David Koepp, and a theatrical trailer and a still gallery. And so the interviews are actually pretty good, and you get a nice little bit of background on what went into making the movie and what have you. And it's fascinating seeing some of these people like Alec Baldwin and Penelope and Miller look you see them on screen in the movie, and then you see them as they are now, or I should say now as in when this Blu-ray was put together, and you can definitely see that time has taken its toll. I mean, but Penelope and Miller still look pretty good though, so here's that. But so yeah, it's fascinating seeing watching the movie and then listening to the interviews and having them look back on the movie. And one of the things that I thought was nice about these interviews, and other people pointed this out when reviewing this Blu-ray, is that even though the movie bombed, and the franchise that they had wanted to create, starting with this movie, never came to fruition, all the people involved, all the people that were interviewed here, for the special features, none of them have anything bad to say about the movie. It's like they all, regard the movie as a good movie, and they, look back on, their time working on the movie with, nothing but fondness. And, Alec Baldwin, I remember, there was a part, in one of the parts when they're interviewing him, I mean, one, it's sort of fascinating, looking at him, he looks like this in the movie, and then seeing him, much older, and what have you. So it's like night and day. But at the same time, I mean, you could tell that he had fun, working on it. And, that was nice to see. It's that even if a movie doesn't do well financially, it doesn't necessarily mean that, the people who made the movie had a bad time with it. It's just, sometimes that's how it works out. So that was nice to see, though, that, the people involved in the movie actually enjoyed making the movie. So that was cool to see. But unfortunately, that's, all we get. I mean, they're good interviews, don't get me wrong, but it would have been nice if, say there'd been like a commentary track, because Russell Mulcahy, of the stuff I've listened to by him, such as, Razorback and Highlander, the commentary tracks he did for those movies, he's always, a good listen, when it comes to, say, telling stories about making, the movie making, whatever it is he was working on, and what have you, because you get a lot of information about the movie, that he's doing the commentary for, but you also get a bunch of other anecdotes, about, stuff that was going on at the time, and sometimes some really fun or funny stories. So, unfortunately, there's no commentary track, but it would have been nice had there been one. And also considering, how iconic of a character the Shadow is and how much influence he's had on other characters that have come after him over the years, it would have been nice if there'd been sort of like maybe a documentary about, how the Shadow came to be, like his roots as a radio show narrator to, his own literary, character, in pulp detective stories, and then, regular comic book stories as well, and then of course getting to here, it would have been nice if there had been a documentary like that, considering how multifaceted the Shadow story is, but unfortunately we don't get that. But I mean, it's sort of touched on in some of the interviews here that are available, but at the same time most of the focus is on the movie as opposed to, say, the creation of the character himself. So yeah, I mean, the interviews are a good bonus feature or good supplemental material, but unfortunately, that's the only real special feature that there is, other than the theatrical trailer and a still gallery. So also, I will say though that, like a lot of Blu-rays, that have come out over the years, there's a reversible cover art. And that was actually, if I remember correctly, this was like the original theatrical poster art. So that was pretty cool. So if you want to, you can actually like take this and, flip it around, to where, it's like that, or you could just, keep it like this. So, but yeah, so yeah, that was The Shadow. It was a fun movie, and it's a bummer that this cinematic world of The Shadow wasn't further explored, but as a standalone movie, it's a good one. So thank you for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. So thanks for watching. Y'all take care. Good night. Bye.